Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the plot to seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is part 1, chapter 6. To the general's surprise, McGuire stopped off to see him, this time in a hired limousine, on the way back from the convention. The man said nothing about the contretemps with Clark, although Butler was certain he must have heard about it, and his manner was as buoyant and friendly as ever. He boasted to Butler about having put over the gold standard resolution. The general pointed out wryly that no action had been taken at the convention to endorse the soldiers' benefits or the soldiers' bonus. McGuire airily repeated that his contention that there was no point in that until the country had sound currency. Shortly afterward, McGuire came to Newtown Square again and surprised the general with the news that a dinner had been arranged by Boston veterans in his honor. He was promised transportation in a private car, and McGuire beamed. Butler would be paid $1,000 to speak at the dinner, in favor of the gold standard, of course. Butler was dumbfounded at McGuire's incredible persistence. Surely the indefatigable bond salesman had realized by this time that he was barking up the wrong tree, but perhaps, the general speculated, McGuire felt challenged to, quote, make the sale, end quote, in much the same manner that he undoubtedly sought to overcome the sales resistance of reluctant prospects for his bonds. And apparently, McGuire was convinced that only Smedley Butler had the prestige and popularity among veterans that his coterie needed to put over their scheme. Irked by the new attempt to bribe him, Butler rasped that he had never been paid $1,000 for any speech and had no intention of accepting such a sum to let words be put in his mouth. Chagrined but undiscouraged, McGuire cheerfully promised that he would come up with some other more acceptable plan to utilize the general's talents as a public speaker. In October, the former Marine running for office in Brooklyn, New York, a former Marine, begged Butler to make some campaign speeches on his behalf. Butler was hesitant because he was about to leave on a tour of the country for the veterans of foreign wars, speaking for the bonus and the members in the VFW as the best way to get it. But loyalty to the men who had served under him took him first to Pennsylvania Station. To his astonishment, he was met by McGuire. The bond salesman had somehow known where he was headed and asked to accompany him. Butler consented, more and more intrigued by the ubiquitous McGuire, who kept turning up everywhere he went like a bad penny. He found himself even growing perversely fond of McGuire for his stubborn refusal to take no for an answer. In the Marines, Butler had always had a soft spot for incorrigible rascals who brightened up monotonous routine by their unpredictable shenanigans. Besides, he was still curious to learn more about what the plotters in the gold scheme were up to. McGuire now revealed that a new plan to involve the general through his impending lecture tour for the VFW. Wasn't he, McGuire probed, going to use the opportunity to speak out on public issues important to the veterans? Butler wasn't sure whether this was simply a shrewd guess or whether McGuire somehow had eyes and ears all over the country. Butler declared that he believed that democracy was in danger from growing anti-democratic forces within the country and that he planned to appeal to the nation's veterans to unite against this threat. At the same time, he wanted to alert them the risk of being dragged into another war by the propaganda of organizations camouflaged with patriotic trappings. McGuire looked thoughtful. Then he asserted that the group he represented really had the identical objectives. He urged Butler to let him go along on the tour. He would stay in the background, enlisting veterans in, quote, a great big super organization to maintain our democracy, end quote. Butler lost no time squelching that idea. He admitted that he couldn't keep McGuire off any train he rode, but made it firmly clear that he would not be associated with the plans of McGuire and his rich friends in any way. He softened the reprimand by saying he did not want to hurt the feelings of a wounded veteran, but McGuire would have to understand that he could not be used to aid money schemes. McGuire said peevishly that he couldn't understand why Butler refused to be a businessman like himself. The general expressed blunt suspicions of McGuire's real reasons for wanting to trail in the wake of his VFW tour. McGuire protested that he had no intention of doing anything subversive. Then he made the general a new offer. If Butler would merely insert in each of his VFW speeches a short reference to the need for returning to the gold standard in order to benefit veterans when a bonus bill was passed, McGuire and his backers would pay him $750 per speech, 3 times what the VFW was paying him. Butler replied emphatically that he would refuse to abuse the veterans' trust in him, even if the offer were for $100,000. Frustrated, McGuire took his departure abruptly. Soon afterward, Butler began to swing around the country for the VFW. He was no longer bothered, for the moment, by the persistent attentions of Jerry McGuire, who left for Europe on December 1st on a mission for his backers. McGuire took his departure against the background of a steadily rising chorus of hatred for, quote, that cripple in the White House, end quote, by big business leaders. It was reflected in the anti-Roosevelt slant of both news and editorials in the business-oriented press. In the eyes of America's industrialists and bankers, the president, if not an actual secret communist, was dedicated to destroying the nation's capitalist economy by the New Deal, which they labeled, quote, creeping socialism, end quote. Many believed that unless FDR were stopped, he would soon take America down the same road that the Russians had traveled. They were horrified by his recognition of the Soviet Union on November 16, 1933, seeing it as a sinister omen. They were equally appalled by his speech 6 weeks later, promising that the United States would send no more armed forces to Latin America to protect private investments. Some business leaders envied their counterparts in Italy, who had financed Mussolini's rise to power. Il Duce's efficiency and the dictatorial control of labor unions by his corporate state. Thomas Lamont, a J.P. Morgan partner, praised the dictator for his methods of providing low-paying jobs, cutting the public debt, and ending inflation. We all count ourselves liberal, I suppose, Lamont told the Foreign Policy Association. Aren't we liberal enough to be willing for the Italian people to have the sort of government they apparently want? Butler, who had not known that McGuire had left for Europe, received a postcard from him from the French Riviera, reporting only that he and his family were having a wonderful time. Another card came from McGuire in June 1934, this time from Berlin. Butler surmised that the bond salesman's long stay in Europe had to be on business, paid for by his boss or all his backers. But what kind of business? More shenanigans in connection with the gold standard? Continuing his tour of the VFW, Butler observed more and more storm signals flying in the United States as he traveled around the country. The nation was rapidly becoming polarized between the forces of left and right. Demagogues with apparently inexhaustible funds for propaganda and agitation led, quote, patriotic, end quote, crusades against communists, Jews, and, quote, Jewish bankers, end quote, who were alleged to be behind the New Deal. That June, Roosevelt further inflamed big business by a whole new series of New Deal acts that crippled stock speculation, set up watchdog agencies over the telephone, telegraph, and radio industries, stopped farm foreclosures, prevented employers from hindering unionization, and compelled them to accept collective bargaining. As an epidemic of turbulent strikes broke out, the orchestration of Roosevelt hatred in the nation's press rose to a fresh crescendo. To Herbert Hoover, the New Deal represented class hatred preached from the White House, despotism, and universal bankruptcy. Butler was intrigued by the July 1934 issue of Fortune, the loose magazine read by America's leading industrialists and bankers, which devoted a whole edition to glorifying Italian fascism. It was produced by Laird S. Goldsborough, foreign editor for Time, who asked Fortune's wealthy readers, quote, whether fascism is achieving in a few years or decades such a conquest of spirit of man as Christianity achieved in only 10 centuries, end quote. He concluded, quote, the good journalist must recognize in fascism certain ancient virtues of the race, whether or not they happen to be momentarily fashionable in his own country. Among these are discipline, duty, courage, glory, sacrifice, end quote. In that summer of 1934, it was not difficult to detect the acrid smell of incipient fascism in the corporate air. Smedley Butler's large hawk nose was soon to detect more than a mere whiff of it.